So our conversation turns to something else, and that is essentially talking about economics, talking about business, talking about the livelihood of Nigerians, talking about the 2020 budget. Successfully, the National Assembly has been able to reverse the budget cycle to a January-December cycle.
Potentially.
What do you mean?
Well, it hasn't been signed by the president, so
Okay,
we're
well,
waiting
yes.
for that.
Well, correct, potentially. But then, that's the hope, and we're looking at the budget 2020 and how that is going to help Nigeria move to the next level, as the president and the ruling party has said. Joining us for this conversation about the highlights, the pros and cons, are former chief economist to Zenith Bank, Mr. Marcelo Keke, as well as an economist and CEO of Streetnomics, Gospel Ebele. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Okay.
So, let me start with you, Mr. Okeke. So, the budget has been passed by the National Assembly. One signature makes it a law. Are you hopeful?
Yes, I'm hopeful.
That was a tricky one.
I say I'm hopeful. A budget is a plan. So that means the plan is in place. Once the president signs it. And more hopeful, given the fact that for the first time, it's very likely the budget, will come live on the first day of January 2020. So I'm quite hopeful.
What are the things outstanding for you in the budget, especially as proposed and as passed?
Thank you so much. For the very first time in recent times, if you like, the budget is being backed up with something that looks like an assurance that more money will be coming into the tills of the federal government. Unlike before, when budgets are based on just some kind of whimsical expectations, if you like. I'm saying this because of the finance bill that's almost has been going on concurrently in terms of levels of approval at the National Assembly. And it's also expected that before the dawn of January 1, 2020, it will also become an act. So we have Finance Act. And there's a lot in the Finance Act that shows that more money will flow in from sources that hitherto were not there.
So that's the part about implementation and funding the budget that
Yes.
you are hopeful about.
Yes.
Okay, let's bring in Mr. Obele. There's always been the talk about the National Assembly breaking a record. 60 days, the budget was passed, and a lot of people thought we're moving in the right direction. But I'd first like to ask you, looking at the budget, the amendments, what we have as passed by the National Assembly, what hits you first?
Well, it's not surprising because basically every year you find that increase when it goes through the National Assembly. Most likely it comes out about 500 billion higher, within that range than what went in terms of proposed budget. So it was expected that it would go slightly higher, but the hit for me is just the structural design of the budget. And looking at the 2019 budget, we discovered that so far there have been like some 58% level of implementation for that 2019 budget. And we see that so far we've only accumulated about 50% of revenue. And then that revenue has been majorly because of drop in the oil volume production in the sense, and not necessarily oil prices. So you discover that there are still deep structural issues around the budget, around the design, around the structure of the budget and all of that. You still have the debt servicing way higher than the capital expenditure. You still have a recurrent expenditure-driven budget. And it was also reflected in 2019 implementation report that the budget largely was successful on administering recurrent expenditure, so that is paying salaries and every other personnel cost. And then for the capital side of things, we've not yet hit 1 trillion expenditure on the 2019 budget, so it's still in view. But we've already hit about 3 trillion in terms of the recurrent expenditure. So if you look at the structural design, the execution, the implementation and everything that makes up the 2020 budget in view of the next year, discover that it's still a cost-driven budget in the sense. It's not proactive enough to move us in that critical mass of things into the that aspire where we choose to be as a nation and as a people. It's still cost-driven. It still mounts a lot of pressure on SMEs who are already driven in that struggle, daily struggle of trying to get business moving. And then there's still also a high cost of governance. So in the sense of things, structurally speaking, it's more of a cost cycle and repetition of structural deficits or misalignments in the Nigerian economy than a budget of growth.
You hit a nerve. You see, I smile. You shouldn't have
And a
gone
budget that
way,
will
but-
facilitate the required level of growth and true development for the people.
I'll come back to you on the SME thing, so it doesn't look like I'm actually shooting an arrow. But let me go to Mr. Okeke.
Okay.
He mentioned something, and it's something that we have all seen: expenditure over capital investment. Simple economics says, don't spend more than you make. Isn't that what we seem to be doing?
Well, maybe historically has been so, but I have also told you that government is aware and conscious of that. And that was why the Minister of Finance said that this economy doesn't have a debt problem. And we have what we have is funding problem. And that is why the government has come up with this initiative, to have the finance bill, which will soon become an act, and which is very likely to generate a huge chunk of, money to finance the budget. In addition to, our oil production that's reasonably high, also driven by reasonably high price of oil in the international market. And so all things being equal, and more so, the stability that the fact that the budget will take off in January 1 will bring into the whole budgetary process.
All right.
I say again, all things being equal, we are likely going to see a better performance of the budget.
But what happens?
Yes.
We're talking about the 2020 budget, but let's not forget that the 2019 budget is still in operation. So
Yes.
help us understand what happens to the 2019 budget as soon as the 2020 budget kicks off. Does it swallow it? Do we abandon it? How does it work?
Well, you know what has been happening over the years for some time? That has always kind of flow in, meaning that while we are waiting for the approval of a current year's budget, the past year's own is allowed to continue to run. Do you understand? So, but this time, if the 2020 budget, as we expect, takes off January 1, 2020, you understand? It's likely, some of the projections or whatever in 2019 will be carried forward.
Okay.
Yes. Some of the proposals will be carried forward.
There are some, conversations as to how this budget touches the man on the street.
Okay.
We'll be back to take that further when we return from this break. Please stay with us. Once the budget is signed, it becomes law. And that means that is the document that will be the expenditure framework for the nation in the year 2020. But here now, we're just discussing some of the components of this bill that hopefully will become a law and how it'll affect every single one of us in Nigeria at this moment. We still have a gentleman in the studio, Mr. Okeke and Mr. Obele. Mr. Okeke, let me begin with you in this segment.
Okay.
One of the elements of this budget, the budget had an accompanying document, which was a finance bill.
Yes.
And one of the critical objectives, one of the 5 objectives of the finance bill is to support MSMEs.
Yes.
And you agree that 60 to 70% of the average economy in the world of any country, is made up of SMEs.
Yes.
Generally. How friendly, critically speaking, do you see this budget in itself to developing the small and medium enterprise sector?
I must thank you very much for this question. I will not tell you I have read inside out the content of the finance bill, but I have just flipped through to know that it has sections that are so favorable to the SMEs, especially the fact that any SME that ends up not having or just has something like below 25 billion, sorry,
Million.
25 million naira turnover is exempted from, VAT, value-added tax. It's not going to be bothered with that. And if they have anything above 25 million to 100 million, they only operate at 20% VAT, and it's so graduated. So you can see that the real micro and small scale industries we're talking about, you know what 25 million turnover is? So many of them are below that. And so government deliberately remove them from the trouble.
That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at that would be, what are the enabling environments for the MSMEs to grow?
I have said this one. Let me also tell you the other one. The other one is that there are so many concessionary loan initiatives for the SMEs. Like the Central Bank of Nigeria has arranged, loan, for the SMEs that is single digit. In fact, low single digit, meaning they have facility they can access at 5%, 7% interest rate. That's the central bank.
How easy is that, Mr. Okeke?
Forget about, let me tell you, when you talk about business has to be organized. And there are levels of being organized. It requires them to, for example, you have to register. You understand? Register your name, a business name. You have to have a business name. That is one. Even when you cannot, and you join a cooperative, you're a member for a cooperative, the fact that you're a member and the leadership can certify that you're a regular member qualifies you, to get some facilities. And I know about that. So there are levels. You understand? There are levels. So the government is conscious of this and is coming up with so many initiatives. I'm talking about Central Bank. There are so many other, global agencies, IMF, World Bank, that have this concessionary loan arrangement for the SMEs. If you're in that sector, you will notice all this.
Okay, Mr. Obele.
Yes.
What's your own take on the SME angle of this conversation? Because many of them, once they hear budget, it doesn't really mean much to them. But if government is making plans for them and the people do not know about it, how do they take advantage of it?
I think first and foremost, we're in an environment where economics have not been made friendly and usable for the average Nigerian. So we still talk so much in terms of the macroeconomics, and the average Nigerian is like, do I need the GDP figures for anything? Do I need to know about inflation figures? So he or she still feels cut out from the conversation. And it's way more than that. Economics is life. That said, the idea around the budget itself is a very powerful finance instrument to transform a nation in no time, ideally. Now, it's a finance instrument that goes through policy programs, initiatives, interventions, and all of that to reach different cluster areas in an economy for that impact. Now, you may get the finance, in this case, I don't believe we've gotten the financing right, which is the budget. You may get the financing right. If you don't get the policy and the initiatives and the intervention process right, you will still have the monies literally sinking because it's going to become a leakage, not an investment into the economy. So we don't have the financing right. Then if you talk about the policy, the initiatives and intervention, who drives them? Institutions. So in the situation where you don't have institutions that have the capacity to drive, to take government expenditure and make it a conduit pipe towards SMEs and all other segments in the economy, and then rejig that growth and development and all that, you begin to find that growing gap or disparity between what the news is saying or what the government is saying about budgets and then the average man on the street / the SME. That said, if you look at the Nigerian SME space, the Nigerian SME landscape properly, you discover that what informs that space is largely survival. So I cannot be thinking about how I would sell a product today because I want to survive or make a living in a very harsh economy. And then you're telling me about the budget, that I cannot also see how that ties into enabling my business to grow.
So how do we solve that? How do we bridge that gap?
There are too many different blocks to close. I think first of all would be to, aside just the political will, which in my opinion sounds overemphasized, but it's still very much critical because what we have are political statements, not necessarily political will. So we need to transit into a genuine place of political will to enable SMEs grow. Now it's a lingo all over the place. You hear that the budget is a budget of sustained growth and job creation. But what's our ideology about growth? it takes me back again to the GDP question. About 4 to 5 years ago, we had a growth rate of 7%. Now we have a growth rate of 2%. The idea is not necessarily the growth rate. The idea is the quality of the growth. How inclusive is that growth? So we need to have that political will has to be in place, number one. Then two, we need to get that financing right. Now, debts are not necessarily a bad thing. The question is, what are you using those monies for? So regardless of how much we want to borrow or how far we want to borrow, if we are still coming back to finance recurrent expenditure or recurrent-driven projects, we will be far away from enabling the budget as a tool through policy pipelines to reach the SMEs. Yeah, so the key would be rejigging that finance solution into the capital expenditure space, right, and then creating the necessary infrastructure that SMEs need to move freely, to do logistics and all of that. And for me also, I think it's also very important that we begin to think of the value systems around the country. Because the average businessman and the business environment, when you think of ease of doing business now, you start thinking of different rankings that have been provided by the World Bank and all of that. But yet, there is there are wrong value systems that don't enable that ease of doing business. So we need to deal with those value systems at the same time. That's the soft infrastructure and then the hard infrastructure.
All right. Maybe that's why we have the...
Can I say something, please? There's something I want to say. There's a point I want to make, if you allow me. Let's not be theoretical in all these things. I'm involved in the SME thing. Listen, last year when the National Association of Small and Medium Scale Enterprises Lagos State Chapter had their AGM at FIRO in Lagos, I was invited as a keynote speaker. And we are talking on this economy. And I interact with them. Their number is so large, they're so huge, they're enlightened, all kinds of people are in it, and all kinds of government agencies interact with them on a daily basis. They are getting informed. They are not just people who just drop into SME. It's deliberate. They go into it as experienced people and enlightened people so they understand the government policies. Economists like us are here, are there. Chartered accountants are there. Ex-bankers are there. Ex-government officials are there as SME people. But if we sit here and just talk theory, you think things are not happening. People are going into that sector and a lot is happening. The government policies are being drilled down through them.
He's also speaking.
No. So I am telling you, listen, this takes time for you to see the fruit. You understand? The economy has been bad, but there's a turnaround effort and process, and that's what we are going through.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay, let me keep it there.
Let me. There are figures out there, and I think it's something that will give anyone concern. Yes, just as you said, it's easy to sit in an air-conditioned space and theorize about these things. But in the real sector out there, they're having issues with water, they're having issues with health, they're having issues with education. The figures are out there. The World Poverty Clock is putting the poverty, belt of Nigeria above 95 million people. The president said on June 12 that the nation should plan to pull 100 million people out of poverty over the next 10 years. How is that going to happen if not through these SMEs? So, yes, economists are talking, but I think the argument here is to make this conversation simple enough for the people to embrace so that they don't just have it, they don't just understand it, they also own it. How do we achieve that?
Thank you so much. And that is why I started by telling you how organized the SMEs are. And they have a body. On a daily basis, they have people, they invite experts from various sectors of this economy who interact with them, even experts from government agencies at the highest level. They are very well organized. Let me also tell you this. You see, people who are going into SMEs are not people who are uninformed. They are not illiterates. Do you understand? And let me also say, the government is coming up with new, fresh initiatives, mindful of the figures you have quoted. Things have gone bad. As a matter of fact, it cannot get worse in some areas, meaning there's no lower level to go. And the only level to go is to start turning around. And that is why I told you, something like this finance bill, when last did you hear about it? If you know the content, you know that it is, I don't know the word to use in talking about what is going to, the impact is going to have when it comes to, let me also tell you, on the other hand, for government to now think about SMEs and start making specific provisions for them, it means it is recognized that that's a section, a segment of the economy that provides the proper channel to touch the people.
Okay.
Because one day SME starts working well and start doing well, in fact, they will attract more people. Right. There are some people out there who are confused as to where to go and what to do. Do you understand? Okay. But many SMEs are already serving or should be serving as models as we are going on. I don't want to start mentioning names.
I understand why the MSME topic is really touchy, because it's actually a big deal, and I understand that we need to pay attention to it. But let's go back to the budget, just look at some of the things happening with the 2020 budget proposal. So the budget came with the finance bill. The finance bill is still at the National Assembly, but then it is leaving with the procurement bill, the Public Procurement Act, which has been amended. Also. And the members of the National Assembly said something about procurement, how it is vital to the implementation of any budget. So the act is being amended.
Yes.
Interestingly, it came with the finance bill, but it's leaving with the procurement bill. So I like us to walk through the importance of procurement, because we see some of these appropriations and we see what they are used for, and you can't connect the dots. So what is the importance of procurement? And I'd like to begin with Mr. Bailey first, because
no problem.
So what is the importance of procurement in this budgeting process?
I think it's very necessary, because it's important we keep reviewing that process, because if you look at the budget structure, many things will be acquired and a lot of things has to be done to facilitate that implementation, to improve the possibilities of implementation. Now, for procurement, from my own perspective, I think it largely has to do with the culture, how we engage that buying and services space and the decisions around what to do and why we do what we do. So the laws and the Procurement Act and all these things are coming along with the budget. If implemented and if follows through, especially with the institutions, I keep going back to the institutions because at the end of the day, these are the pipelines through which this whole process will play out, for implementation. So if follows through closely, and of which I have my reservations about, if follows through closely, then we should see a good level of progress. So it's not just enough to have that alongside with the budget. It's more about, in my own opinion, the institutions that will take on all of these things, vis-a-vis all of the items on the budget, and then execute accordingly. And then do we have the right legal framework, I don't want to use punish offenders or for the sake of disciplinary measures and the likes. Do we have that in place? And then what are the checks and balances? What are the communications? How do we get to follow through on if the ICPC, these institutions are yielding or following through with the act closely vis-a-vis the budget implementation and its items?
Okay, let's take a look at one information, the piece of information that we got from PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. They did a slide, a kind of summary of the budget. That's it on the screen there. Okay. And if you look at one of those items, the capital, I want to pay attention to the debt service and the capital expenditure figures. In the 2019 budget, it's 2.4 billion, but in the 2020 proposal is 2.1 billion. That's for the debt servicing. The capital expenditure in the 2019 budget
I think it's the other way, actually. 2.4 for 2020 and 2.1 for 2019. But interestingly,
I thought that was the first one.
But interestingly, the National Assembly actually raised that debt servicing figure to 2.7. And I think we saw that in that report.
That was what was read.
Which is why I raised the issue the other time. So the debt servicing figures are increasing. Isn't that what it looks like now? Compared to capital expenditure, investments versus debt payments or debt servicing, not even payments.
Okay. Do I talk about that?
Please.
Well, yes. It could be a cause to worry, that more money should be going into debt servicing. Do you understand? But
it's actually a cause of worry. So forgive me for jumping in. It's actually a cause of worry for the private sector. LCCI, Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, NECA, they are all screaming.
Yes, I am also screaming that. And that's why I say it's cause for worry. Do you understand? But let me also tell you, just like my colleague said, debt per se, or borrowing per se, is not anything bad, you know, in economics and the economy. But how the whole thing is managed, do you understand? I want to be optimistic that this economy, the more money will flow in. Do you understand? Given the things we have mentioned now, the new initiatives, you know, the oil price
And the external
volume of
borrowing
product.
plan?
You have not taken me to that. I'm hearing it from you now. You know,
I see what you did there.
you know. So let's talk about what you know is already on ground. That one is still ongoing. You should know. You know, talk about with the National Assembly, the 30 billion, whatever. But with what is on ground, what we are seeing in the budget, there's cause for concern. I'm telling you. But I believe that the government is becoming wiser in terms of debt management as a whole, in terms of servicing it, paying the principal, you know, and so on and so forth. So, with the new initiatives and, you know, new concern, we are saying people are worried and all that, I believe government will not handle the situation in a way that it will pose more danger or more harm to the economy. And more so, all things being equal, if the new initiatives bring in so much money that is expected, do you understand? For example, as we speak now, the budget is approved at oil price projection of $57 per barrel. But as we speak, the price of oil in the international market is hovering around $64 per barrel. And it could go up to 70, like much earlier in the year, it hit up to $72 per barrel.
But OPEC
so,
is suggesting cuts also.
the cut by OPEC, all things being equal, is likely to shoot up price.
We think so.
Yes.
Because OPEC is not just the player.
Once it cuts down, once the volume of supply, you know, now goes down.
That's all things being equal.
Thank you,
But
and I
we
have
know
to say
all
that.
things are
No,
never
listen. Why you have to say so is that oil price movement is subject to so many variables,
Exactly.
including the situation in the Middle East and so many other things, including what Trump says and what Trump does. Do you understand? So they all affect the price of oil. But let us say all things being equal, meaning that this economy will experience so much inflow of funds. And when that happens, it means that the issue of debt will be better handled.
All right, well, we could go on and on this conversation,
You
but
know.
we really just have to go because our time is already fast spent. We have to thank you very much, gentlemen, for being a part of this conversation. Mr. Gospel Obele is an economist and CEO of Streetnomics. Thank you so much for your time, as well as Mr. Marcelo Keke, former chief economist at Zenith Bank. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. We're back to wrap this all up. Please stay with us.